On April 14, 1935, known as Black Sunday, the worst storm of the decade rose up out of the west. At its peak, it climbed 20,000 feet into the air and stretched 1,000 miles wide. As 300 million tons of dust began its deadly roll across the country, there was a 53-year-old government bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. waiting for it. He was counting on this storm to be powerful enough to finally rally Congress to action. The man was Hugh Bennett, who would become one of the heroes of this disaster. He had been a soil surveyor in the U.S. Department of Agriculture for 32 years. He was one of the few who recognized that something more than just a drought had caused the Dust Bowl. Bennett believed the disaster was man-made.
Nobody knew more about dirt in the United States than Hugh Bennett. He liked to say that he camped out in every state in the United States and slept on that dirt. But he also had an advanced degree in soil science.
Roosevelt recognized his expertise, and in 1933, the president put Bennett in charge of the newly formed Soil Erosion Service. Bennett talked to the farmers, walked their barren fields, and was appalled by what he saw. He traveled across the country, trying to educate people about techniques that could be implemented to preserve the soil.
We Americans have been the greatest destroyers of land, of any race or people, barbaric or civilized.
Bennett didn't blame the farmer. He blamed government settlement policies for luring them west to farm unsuitable land with inadequate rainfall. The grass had held the prairie intact for thousands of years. Tearing it up was like peeling the skin off the land. The wound would not heal without major intervention. In 1935 alone, 850 million tons of topsoil had blown away, 6 tons of dirt for every citizen in the United States. An average loss of 3 inches of soil left patches of barren ground so infertile it would never hold a crop again. Despite 4 years of this unfolding disaster in the high plains, Congress was occupied with the multiple problems growing out of the Depression. It hadn't yet passed any significant legislation or committed any funds to save the high plains. But the Black Sunday blizzard changed everything.
The dirt was still blown and making its way south and then making its way east towards Washington, D.C. Bennett is speaking to a group of United States senators. He's trying to get them to create the Soil Conservation Service. And Bennett is just impassioned. And as he's talking, the storm, the leftover residue of Black Sunday, is making its way towards the nation's capital. An aide comes up and whispers in his ear and says, "Keep talking, it's almost here." So Bennett goes on, tells a few more stories and jokes. And then suddenly, as if on cue, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky in Washington, D.C. goes dark. And Bennett points to the window and he says, "There, gentlemen, there. That's what I'm talking about. There goes the state of Oklahoma."
That's what caused the people on the East Coast to understand that the Dust Bowl was real and that they needed to do something to help the people in the Great Plains.
Just 2 weeks after Black Sunday, Roosevelt created the Soil Conservation Service under the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the first government office of its kind in the world. FDR proclaimed that the history of every nation is written in the way in which it cares for its soil. He was determined to undo the damage that had been done to the plains. Bennett pushed to regrow the prairie and seeded 100,000 acres in Kansas with native grasses. Roosevelt favored something more dramatic, something instantaneous. He devised a plan called the Shelter Belt.
That was the idea, to plant this giant row of trees from the Canadian border to the Mexican border, 100 miles wide. They thought the trees would shelter them from the wind, and in between the trees they would be able to farm.
Crews were dispatched to plant more than 220 million trees over the next 7 years. Trees that would act as both a windbreaker and an anchor for the soil. Tractors leveled off sand dunes, and with a program called Operation Dust Bowl, Bennett introduced the farmers to new ways of tilling the land. Use of the Lister plow created deep, broad furrows and pushed the soil up into high crests in line with prevailing winds. The restructured ground surface slowed erosion. From 1936 to 1937, farmers used this method on more than 8 million acres. The government also encouraged contour farming, following the elevation lines of a slope, resulting in level furrows that curve around the land and help preserve precious rainfall. By 1938, 3 years after the formation of the Soil Conservation Service, the farmers began to see results. Conservation efforts had slowed the amount of soil loss by 65%, but the land would not truly begin to heal until the rains came back. The drought didn't end until the fall of 1939. Ocean temperatures and the low-level jet stream finally returned to their normal pattern, bringing rain back to the high plains.